Hello, everyone. Today we are going to learn about one of the most essential frameworks in macroeconomics, the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model. This model helps us understand inflation, unemployment, recessions, and economic growth using a single framework. The aggregate demand and aggregate supply model shows what determines total demand and total supply in the economy, and how they interact at the macro level. It serves four major purposes. First, identifying shocks. The model distinguishes between demand-side shocks like consumer confidence changes, government spending, and interest rate changes, and supply-side shocks like oil price spikes and productivity changes. Second, understanding policy effects. The model acts as a map for fiscal policy, such as government spending and tax cut, and monetary policy, raising federal rates. Third, tracking economic growth. Aggregate demand and aggregate supply model shows how changes in technology, labor, or capital push the economy's potential output outward. Fourth, predicting outcomes. By analyzing curve shifts, we can predict whether an event will lead to growth, recession, or inflation. This model is the foundation for understanding the entire macroeconomy. Before we get into the graphs, let's look at keywords. You need to be comfortable with these terms: price level and real GDP, aggregate demand and aggregate demand curve, and aggregate supply, including the short-run aggregate supply and long-run aggregate supply curves. We will also frequently reference potential real GDP, which is our target for healthy economy. We will use these terms throughout this lecture. In the aggregate supply and aggregate demand model, the axis represents the entire economy. The vertical axis is the price level, measured by an index like the GDP deflator. It's important to note that the price level is a snapshot of average prices, which is different from the inflation rate, the percentage change in those prices over time. Horizontal axis is real GDP, which represents the total level of output adjusted for inflation. In macroeconomics, we use the Latin phrase ceteris paribus, meaning all other things held constant. In the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model, whenever we say a change in the price level causes a movement along the curve, ceteris paribus means income stays constant and wages stay constant, expectations stay constant, and input prices stay constant, and only the price level changes. This allows us to isolate the effect of one variable at one time. Aggregate supply is the total quantity of output firms will produce at each price level. Firms' production decision depends on uh, price of their output and cost of labor, cost of materials, and cost of energy. If output prices rise while input prices remain fixed, firms expect higher profit and then they produce more. This creates the upward slope of the aggregate supply curve. When we graph the aggregate supply curve, the real GDP is on the horizontal axis and the price level is on the vertical axis. As the price level rises, firms generally increase real GDP to capture more profit. You will also see a vertical line representing potential GDP, which we will discuss as the entire full capacity. Now we introduce the math idea behind the slope. To interpret these curves, must we must remember the concept of slope. Slope measures how steep a line is and telling us how much the vertical value y changes for every 1 unit change in the horizontal value x. This tells us how steep a curve is and how its response output is to changes in. For interpretation, a positive slope indicates the upward sloping line, which means an increase, while a negative slope indicates a downward sloping line, which means a decrease. A zero slope is a flat horizontal line, and an undefined slope is a perfectly vertical line. In the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model, we see how much change in the real GDP in the horizontal axis results from the change in the price level. Let's look at how the slope of the aggregate supply curve changes depending on where the economy is operating. The aggregate supply curve has three distinct regions. In the flat region from point A to point B, the economy is well below potential GDP. There are many idle resources, such as unused factories and unemployed workers. So when prices rise, firms can easily increase the production. This is why the slope is large, 300. Output rises a lot, even with small changes in the price level. In the intermediate region from point C to point D, like closer to potential GDP, the economy begins to use more of its resources. Firms can still increase output, but not as easily. As a result, the slope becomes steeper. Output responds less, like 100 real GDP, given price changes. In the near vertical region from point E to point F, the economy is close to full capacity. Workers, machines, and factories are almost fully utilized. Even if prices rise, the firms cannot meaningfully increase production. That's why the curve becomes almost vertical. Output barely responds to price changes, like a 20 GDP. Potential GDP represents the economy's maximum sustainable level of output. At potential GDP, most people who want jobs have jobs. Factories and offices operate at normal long-run capacity. The economy is using resources efficiently. Unemployment equals the natural rate, which is calculated by combining frictional unemployment rates and structural unemployment rates. Potential GDP is not the same as producing at absolute maximum speed. Instead, it represents a level of output that can be maintained without causing excessive inflation or economic strain. In the short run, the economy can produce slightly above potential GDP, but only temporarily. This happens when firms push workers into overtime and machines run extra shifts or operate continuously. Businesses stretch their resources to meet unusually high demand. But this level of production is not sustainable in the long run. Workers burn out, equipment wears down, and production costs rise. So although the aggregate supply curve can extend beyond potential GDP briefly, the economy will, eventually return its long-run capacity. Now we compare what firms can produce in the short run versus the long run. In the short run, wages and many input prices are sticky, like slow to adjust. Because of sticky costs, firms may expand production when prices rise. This is why the short-run aggregate supply curve slopes upward. In the long run, all prices, including wage, fully adjust. Firms can no longer produce above or below potential GDP. This is why the long-run aggregate supply curve is vertical. Output is fixed at potential GDP, regardless of price level. We commonly use the aggregate supply curve as short-run aggregate supply curve, and potential GDP is referred to long-run aggregate supply. Aggregate demand represents total spending on domestic goods and services at its price level. Aggregate demand is made of four components: C plus I plus G plus XM, where C is consumption spending by household, I is investment spending by firms for factories, machines, and new houses. G is government spending on goods and services. XM means net export, like exports minus imports. Any changes in these components will shift the aggregate demand curve. In the left graph, we see that the aggregate demand curve slopes downward. This downward slope shows a negative relationship between the price level and the real GDP. When the price level rises, the economy's total spending falls. When price level falls, total spending rises. And we will now look at why this happens. The aggregate demand curve slopes downward for three main reasons. First reason is wealth effect. Higher prices reduce the purchasing power of people's savings. People feel poorer and cut back on consumption. Second one is interest rate effect. When prices rise, households and firms need more money to buy goods. This increases the demand for money and then raises interest rate and then reduced investment and consumption. Third one is foreign price effect. For example, if US prices rise but foreign prices are fixed, then US goods become more expensive than foreign goods. This leads to fall US exports. Also, foreign goods become cheaper, which leads to rise US imports. Thus, net exports decrease, lowering aggregate demand. As you notice, the aggregate demand curve is drawn steeper than a typical demand curve in a single product, like what we learned last week. This reason is that the three effects we just discussed are real, but not extremely powerful. Increases in price level do reduce total spending, but not dramatically. Thus, the aggregate demand curves slope downward, but appears relatively steep compared to microeconomic demand curves. In the graph above, the aggregate demand curve meets the aggregate supply curve at point E. This intersection is the economy's short-run equilibrium with a price level of 90 and an output level of $8,800 billion. At this point, quantity of aggregate demand and quantity of aggregate supplies are equal, and the economy is stable in the short run. No immediate pressure exists for firms to change output. However, in this equilibrium, there is a gap between equilibrium output and potential GDP. The negative gap between the two real GDP values is called a recessionary gap. It means that the economy is operating below its capacity. Unemployment is above the natural rate, factories and offices have idle capacity, and resources are underutilized. This is typical what happens during recessions. In the long run, the economy will not remain below potential GDP. Something must adjust. Two possible mechanisms can work the recessionary gap. First one is that the aggregate supply shifts left. As the economy recovers, wages and input prices rise. This reduces the short-run output and pushes aggregate supply left. And second one is that the aggregate demand shifts right. Government policies, consumer recovery, or investment increases can raise total spending. Either adjustment moves the economy from point E to a long-run equilibrium F at potential GDP. Notice that the price level rises from 90 to 105, which represent about the 70% inflation rate. This shows that the returning to potential GDP often comes with upward pressure on prices. Thank you for watching.